Somewhere tonight, thousands of ships are still moving across dark water beneath satellite tracking systems most people will never think about. Oil tankers crossing the Arabian Sea, container ships moving through the Strait of Malacca, bulk carriers drifting slowly toward industrial ports long after midnight while rain moves across empty container yards. From above, the world almost looks quiet. But underneath the darkness, the machinery never really stops moving. Energy, food, machinery, copper, liquefied natural gas, industrial components. The physical structure of modern civilization itself. Welcome back to the Black Ledger. Most people experience globalization through screens, prices, charts, headlines. But globalization is also physical. Steel, fuel, ports, pipelines, shipping corridors. Infrastructure stretching across oceans quietly enough that most people rarely think about it, until something interrupts the flow. Take a breath. And imagine standing above the planet very late at night. Thousands of tiny moving lights crossing black oceans beneath cloud cover. Cargo aircraft carrying industrial equipment between continents. Refineries glowing orange against coastal fog. Harbour cranes still operating beneath floodlights while office towers slowly go dark above the ports. The modern world never fully sleeps. It reroutes. And increasingly, more governments seem interested in what happens if too much of the world depends on the same routes at the same time. For decades, much of the global economy moved through a relatively concentrated set of corridors. Certain ports became indispensable. Certain shipping lanes became foundational. Certain currencies became deeply embedded inside energy settlement itself. And after enough years, the system underneath global trade simply started feeling permanent. Stable enough that most people stopped thinking about the infrastructure very much. Physical systems feel different once stability starts feeling less certain. Because every financial system eventually reconnects back to logistics, to fuel, to delivery, to movement. Money settles contracts. But ships still have to arrive. Somewhere tonight, there are probably still shipping analysts beneath fluorescent office lights reviewing maritime traffic patterns before morning. Coffee beside keyboards. Rain against harbour glass. Satellite maps glowing quietly across darkened rooms. Most people inside those buildings are not trying to redesign the world economy. They are just trying to keep things moving before morning. One rerouted shipment at a time. And over the past several years, the conversations around infrastructure have started sounding different. Resilience, redundancy, supply chain security, alternative corridors, backup routes. Not because the old systems vanished, but dependence starts feeling different once too much of the world relies on the same corridors at the same time. Most structural changes begin quietly. A shipping route expands here. A new port agreement there. Pipeline capacity increases somewhere beyond the desert. Rail corridors stretching deeper across regions that once depended entirely on maritime routes. Individually, most of these developments look administrative, technical, easy to ignore. But over enough years, the map underneath the global economy begins changing shape. The rain outside sounds heavier now. Somewhere farther inland tonight, freight trains are still carrying industrial cargo through rain-soaked rail corridors toward distribution hubs that will restart before dawn. Electrical balancing systems are still shifting pressure quietly across regional grids, while refinery maintenance crews continue working beneath floodlights, somewhere beyond the coastline. After midnight, the modern world starts looking more physical. During the day, globalization feels abstract. Charts, headlines, currencies moving across glowing screens. People talking about markets while the machinery underneath them keeps moving quietly in the background. But late at night, the structure becomes easier to see, because underneath finance, there are still ships moving through dark water. Somewhere tonight, Enormous oil tankers are still crossing narrow maritime corridors, carrying enough fuel to keep entire cities alive by morning. Liquefied natural gas drifting toward coastal terminals beneath heavy fog. Refineries glowing orange against black shorelines while rain moves slowly across steel pipelines. Cargo aircraft carrying industrial components through darkness toward manufacturing zones that will restart before sunrise. Most people never see any of this directly. The lights turn on. The trains keep moving. The elevators still work. And eventually, the infrastructure underneath daily life becomes almost invisible. Take a breath. And imagine how much coordination is required just to keep one major city functioning continuously. Fuel deliveries arriving on schedule. Shipping containers unloaded before dawn. Electrical grids balancing pressure through the night. Backup reserves waiting quietly beneath industrial districts. Ports operating beneath floodlights while office towers above them slowly empty. Most people only notice the system once something fails to arrive. For decades, much of the global economy depended on a relatively concentrated set of energy corridors. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal. Narrow passages carrying enormous portions of global trade through dark water every night, while most of the world sleeps. And after enough years, the corridors themselves started feeling permanent, reliable, automatic, as though the movement would never really stop. But systems feel different once stability becomes less certain. Suddenly, distance matters more. Storage capacity matters more. Backup routes matter more. A delayed tanker matters more. A shipping disruption matters more. Suddenly, people start paying attention to things they stopped thinking about years ago. Somewhere tonight, there are probably still people beneath fluorescent office lights, reviewing tanker positions before morning. Radar screens glowing blue across darkened rooms. coffee cooling beside shipping schedules, weather systems moving slowly across maritime maps, container delays updating quietly inside logistics software. Most people inside those buildings are not thinking about history. They are just trying to keep things moving before sunrise. One shipment at a time. And over the past several years, the conversations surrounding infrastructure have started sounding slightly different. Resilience, redundancy, storage capacity, alternative corridors, backup supply chains. Not because the old system disappeared. The ships are still moving tonight. The terminals are still glowing. But dependence starts feeling different once enough disruptions begin stacking on top of each other. Pandemics, shipping delays, insurance complications, regional instability, sanctions, port congestion. One disruption becomes another, then another. The system still works, but people seem less certain it will always work the same way. For a long time, globalization moved toward concentration. Cheaper routes, faster delivery, larger ports, more centralized logistics. And for decades, the system functioned efficiently enough that very few people questioned the direction. A system optimized for speed can start feeling fragile once interruptions happen too often. Somewhere beyond the harbor tonight, tankers are still drifting through black water, carrying enough energy to power industrial regions before morning. Pipelines are still humming beneath rain-soaked ground. Ports are still unloading fuel beneath floodlights and ocean fog. The machinery is still operating. But more countries seem less comfortable depending entirely on a single route now. Especially for systems this important. Shipping routes slowly change political behavior. Pipeline access changes negotiations. Port construction changes trade patterns. Money still follows movement. Fuel still has to arrive. And once governments begin thinking more seriously about resilience, the map underneath global energy movement slowly starts changing shape. Additional pipeline systems appear. Strategic reserves expand. Rail infrastructure deepens across regions once dependent almost entirely on maritime shipping. Energy settlement systems begin attaching themselves to newer trade corridors. Not dramatically, quietly. Small administrative decisions repeated over enough years until eventually the system underneath the world starts feeling different. The rain outside sounds heavier now. Somewhere beyond the darkness tonight, tankers are still crossing black water beneath blinking navigation lights, while coastal refineries wait for deliveries before dawn. The routes carrying energy across the world are slowly becoming less singular than they once were. For a long time, the modern world treated uninterrupted movement almost like a permanent condition. Cargo would arrive, fuel would move, the corridors would remain open. And after enough years, most people stopped thinking very much about how narrow some of those corridors actually were. The Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca. Narrow passages carrying enormous amounts of global trade through dark water every night, while most of the world sleeps. Most people rarely think about these places directly. At certain points, enormous portions of the global economy pass through waterways narrow enough to see the opposite shoreline through fog. Tankers, container vessels, fuel, industrial cargo, all compressed into corridors that can slow down far more easily than most people realize. And imagine what happens once too much movement depends on too few pathways. Across the system tonight, there are probably cargo vessels sitting offshore waiting for clearance beneath heavy rain and blinking navigation lights. Engines idling quietly in dark water. containers stacked motionless above wet steel decks. Delays spreading outward through systems most people will never see directly. Shipping schedules begin shifting quietly behind the scenes. Insurance costs start adjusting before most cargo even reaches port. Somewhere farther down the chain, fuel deliveries arrive slightly later than expected. Routes lengthen. Insurance costs rise. Ports become congested. Refrigerated storage systems still humming inside distribution facilities, waiting for delayed inventory before sunrise. Forklifts parked beneath fluorescent warehouse lighting, while routing software continues recalculating delivery schedules through the night. Most people never see these delays directly. They only notice the effects several weeks later. Slightly higher prices, longer delivery times, empty inventory space where something was expected to be. Screens start flashing long before most people understand what actually slowed down. Across the system tonight, maritime analysts are probably still monitoring vessel traffic beneath fluorescent office lights, while weather systems move slowly across digital shipping maps. Container delays updating quietly across darkened screens. Port congestion reports arriving before dawn. Radar systems tracking movement through heavy weather and narrow maritime lanes. Most people inside those rooms are just trying to keep movement stable before morning. Rain against harbor glass. Coffee going cold beside shipping schedules. For decades, many governments assumed the primary corridors of globalization would remain permanently open, regardless of political tension. Stable enough for energy markets. Reliable enough that most shipping schedules simply kept moving. For a long time, the system mostly worked. The cargo arrived often enough that most people stopped thinking about how fragile uninterrupted movement actually is. Modern life simply continued functioning around the assumption that the corridors would remain open. Late tonight, there are still ports operating beneath heavy weather exactly the way they did 10 years ago. Cranes lifting containers above black water. fuel transfers continuing beneath floodlights. Schedules updating quietly across terminal screens, while rain moves across the harbor outside. From the surface, the machinery still looks stable, familiar, even. Until something slows down. But assumptions feel different once disruptions start happening more often. Pandemics, shipping delays, insurance complications, regional instability, port congestion, sanctions. One disruption becomes another, then another. Ships wait offshore longer than expected. Warehouses begin adjusting delivery schedules before sunrise. Insurance calls continue late into the night. Somewhere farther down the chain, manufacturing timelines quietly begin moving backward by a few days at a time. Most people never notice the disruption at the moment it happens. They notice it later, gradually. Once stability feels less certain, backup systems start appearing almost automatically. Additional ports receive investment. Storage capacity expands. Shipping firms increase contingency planning. Alternative insurance arrangements begin forming beside older ones. Rail infrastructure deepens across regions previously considered secondary. Not dramatically. Quietly. Small adjustments repeated quietly over time, until eventually the system underneath global trade starts feeling different. The digital world feels almost weightless sometimes. Instant, abstract. Yet somewhere beneath that digital layer, physical movement continues through storms, narrow waterways, and crowded ports every hour of the night. Steel moving through rain, fuel moving beneath oceans. But physical systems still depend on geography. Storm systems interrupt movement. Narrow waterways create bottlenecks. Fog slows visibility across crowded shipping lanes. Steel still has to physically arrive somewhere before the system above it can continue functioning normally. Cranes still unload containers before dawn while cities sleep above the harbor. Human coordination continuing through the night while most of the population sleeps. In logistics centers, cargo vessels are still waiting offshore beneath blinking navigation lights. Tankers are still drifting through narrow maritime corridors, carrying energy toward industrial regions that cannot afford interruption. And inside logistics centers around the world, people are still quietly rerouting shipments before morning. Not because the existing system vanished. The ships are still moving tonight. But the system feels narrower once you finally see how much depends on so few routes. Navigation lights drifting slowly against black water. Rain moving across silent container stacks. Somewhere beyond the fog tonight, there are still anchored ships drifting silently beneath blinking navigation lights, waiting for clearance before dawn. The machinery never fully stops. It slows, it reroutes, it waits. More governments seem less willing to depend entirely on a single pathway now. Especially once vulnerability becomes visible. For a long time, most people assumed there was only one real map underneath globalization. One primary set of routes. One dominant financial language. One enormous system connecting fuel, shipping, liquidity, manufacturing, and trade across much of the planet simultaneously. And after enough decades, the architecture underneath that system started feeling almost permanent. Not because people studied it closely, because it kept functioning. The cargo arrived. Fuel continued moving. Containers crossed oceans. Settlement systems stayed online through the night. And eventually, the infrastructure underneath global trade became so familiar that most people stopped thinking about it directly. Like electrical grids, or undersea cables, or shipping lanes disappearing into fog beyond the harbor. But large systems often begin changing quietly, underneath long before the surface appears different. Across industrial corridors, there are probably still conference rooms lit long after midnight, where trade officials are reviewing shipping access agreements most citizens will never hear about. Coffee cups beside half-open reserve reports. Rain moving slowly across dark glass outside financial districts. Satellite maps glowing softly against walls, while cargo projections continue updating through the night. Most of these conversations never become headlines. Most people never notice them happening at all. And yet slowly, another map has started forming beneath the older one. Not replacing it, not overtaking it overnight, just expanding quietly beside it. Additional rail corridors stretching deeper across continents. Regional settlement systems growing beside older financial infrastructure. Ports expanding in locations that once seemed strategically secondary. Pipeline agreements continuing quietly beneath larger geopolitical headlines. Alternative payment arrangements attached directly to physical trade routes. At first, most of these developments looked technical, administrative, easy to ignore. The kind of things buried deep inside infrastructure reports and trade documents. Nobody outside the system ever reads carefully. But structural transitions rarely feel historic while they are happening. At the time, they usually just feel administrative. A shipping agreement adjusted here. A logistics corridor expanded there. An energy contract settled slightly differently than it would have been 15 years ago. Small adjustments repeated quietly over time until eventually the map underneath the world economy starts feeling different. Beyond the coastline, cargo is still moving through the same major corridors that dominated global trade 20 years ago. Inland logistics hubs are still routing freight across rail networks, stretching through industrial districts before dawn. Pipelines continue moving fuel beneath rain-soaked ground, while maintenance crews monitor pressure systems through the night. Container cranes are still unloading steel boxes before sunrise. Radar systems are still tracking maritime movement through heavy weather while cities sleep above the harbor. From the surface, the machinery still looks familiar. But alongside those older corridors, secondary routes have started expanding. Quietly. Additional rail infrastructure, backup energy pathways, regional clearing systems, trade agreements designed around redundancy instead of pure efficiency. Not because governments expect a primary structure to disappear tomorrow morning, but dependence starts feeling different once enough disruptions begin stacking on top of each other. Pandemics, sanctions, port congestion, insurance complications, shipping delays, regional instability. One disruption becomes another, then another. And gradually, systems built almost entirely around uninterrupted flow start adapting to a world that feels less predictable than it once did. For decades, globalization rewarded concentration, larger ports, faster delivery systems, more centralized logistics, more movement compressed into the same major corridors. Efficiency became the priority because efficiency worked. Until resilience started mattering too. Somewhere tonight, there are probably infrastructure planners reviewing long-term supply vulnerabilities beneath fluorescent office lighting while rainwater moves slowly across empty streets outside. Shipping projections spread across conference tables. Freight data glowing against half-dark rooms. Most people inside those buildings are not trying to redesign civilization. They are just trying to reduce exposure before the next disruption arrives. One corridor at a time. Take a moment and imagine looking down at the planet very late at night from somewhere high above cloud cover. Shipping lanes crossing black oceans. Clusters of industrial light surrounding coastal ports. Cargo aircraft drifting between manufacturing zones before sunrise. The old routes are still there, still crowded, still moving. But underneath those familiar pathways, another layer has started forming. Additional routes, systems forming beside older ones. More options than the world used to have. Not fully visible yet, but expanding quietly. The rain outside sounds softer now. Somewhere beyond the harbor tonight, ships are still moving through black water exactly the way they did yesterday. Navigation lights drifting slowly through fog. Container terminals glowing against the coastline before dawn. The machinery never fully stops. New routes appear beside older ones. Movement shifts quietly beneath the surface. The system adapts. More countries seem interested in keeping additional routes available now, especially for systems this essential to daily life. For a long time, people imagined the future as something that would arrive clearly. One world ending, another beginning. A visible transition everyone would recognize immediately while it was happening. But large systems rarely move that way. Usually the change is slower than people expect. Older structures continue functioning while newer structures begin forming quietly beside them. And for a while, both worlds exist at the same time. That is part of what makes structural transitions so difficult to recognize from inside them. The world outside still looks familiar. Markets still open every morning. Cargo still arrives. Fuel still moves through pipelines beneath rain-soaked ground, while ships continue crossing oceans through the night. Most people wake up expecting electricity, deliveries, transportation, internet access, functioning payment systems. And most mornings, the system still provides all of it. From the surface, the machinery still appears stable, Office towers still glow above financial districts long after midnight. Container ports still operate beneath floodlights before dawn. Settlement systems still clear transactions quietly while most of the population sleeps. Most of the system still appears remarkably intact tonight. But underneath that visible stability, the assumptions supporting the system have started sounding slightly different. For decades, globalization moved toward concentration, more integration, larger ports, faster shipping, supply chains stretching across larger distances through the same major corridors. And for a long time, the system functioned efficiently enough that very few countries seriously questioned the direction. Efficiency worked. Until uncertainty started becoming harder to ignore. Now the language around the system sounds different. Exposure, redundancy, resilience, strategic autonomy, supply chain security, alternative settlement infrastructure, backup corridors. Not dramatic language, not revolutionary language, administrative language. The kind of language that appears quietly inside infrastructure planning meetings and trade reports most people never read. Somewhere tonight, central banks are still reviewing reserve exposure beneath fluorescent office lighting long after midnight. Trade officials are still negotiating shipping access agreements across conference tables, scattered with freight projections and logistics schedules. Energy planners are still modeling disruptions that may never happen. Rain moving against dark financial district windows. Coffee cooling beside half-open infrastructure reports. Satellite maps glowing softly against walls inside half-lit rooms. Most people inside those buildings are not trying to redesign the world. They are trying to prepare for a wider range of outcomes than they once expected. And uncertainty changes behavior even before systems physically change. Once governments begin questioning whether uninterrupted access can always be guaranteed, they start building options. Additional reserves. Alternative payment systems. Energy pathways capable of functioning if major corridors slow down. Additional routes beside the older ones. Not necessarily because collapse is imminent. The ships are still moving tonight. The terminals are still glowing. But civilizations rarely remain fully dependent on a single pathway, once vulnerability becomes visible enough. For decades, many countries treated the dominant financial and logistical architecture almost like part of the natural environment. Permanent, stable, always available when needed, like electrical grids, or shipping lanes, or undersea communication cables disappearing into darkness beneath the ocean floor. But systems connected to power rarely feel completely permanent forever, especially once disruptions begin happening often enough that governments start imagining scenarios they previously considered unlikely. Pandemics, shipping delays, sanctions, insurance complications, regional instability, port congestion. One disruption becomes another, then another. Gradually, the system starts adapting to a world that feels less predictable than it once did. Over enough years, those adjustments begin reshaping the structure underneath the world economy. Trade routes diversify. Settlement systems multiply. Reserve strategies become more distributed. Energy infrastructure expands across additional corridors. Financial relationships become more regional. The world still looks deeply connected tonight. But underneath that connection, the architecture has started becoming more layered than it once was. Somewhere tonight, there are probably anchored cargo vessels drifting silently beyond harbor fog, waiting for clearance before dawn. Navigation lights reflecting slowly against black water. Container cranes still unloading steel boxes beneath freezing rain, while cities sleep above the coastline. Radar systems still tracking movement across crowded maritime lanes through the middle of the night. The machinery never fully stops. It slows, it reroutes, it waits. For decades, the dominant assumption was simple. The primary corridors would remain open indefinitely. Now the assumptions sound less certain. And once uncertainty settles deeply enough into the system, secondary structures begin forming almost automatically. Backup routes, backup reserves, backup systems. Not fully replacing the older architecture, just growing quietly beside it. Take a moment and imagine looking down at the planet very late at night from somewhere far above cloud cover. Shipping lanes still crossing black oceans. Ports still glowing beside dark coastlines. Aircraft still carrying industrial cargo through the atmosphere before sunrise. The old system is still there, still crowded, still moving through the night. But underneath the systems that shaped globalization for decades, governments, logistics planners, and financial institutions are already preparing for a world with more routes, more redundancy, and fewer assumptions about permanence. Most of those adjustments still look administrative for now. But over enough years, administrative changes reshape systems too. The world outside your window probably looks almost identical to yesterday. Traffic still moves through wet streets. Office towers still glow above the harbor. Cargo vessels are still crossing dark oceans tonight beneath radar systems and heavy weather most people will never see directly. And somewhere right now, long after midnight, logistics networks are still recalculating routes while cities sleep. From the surface, the machinery still appears stable. Most systems change quietly at first, long before the surface looks any different. Through shipping agreements, infrastructure investment, reserve planning, backup corridors. Small adjustments repeated quietly over time, until eventually the map underneath the world starts feeling different. For decades, globalization concentrated enormous amounts of movement through a relatively narrow set of financial and physical corridors. And for a long time, the system worked efficiently enough that many people assumed the structure would simply continue expanding forever. Now the assumptions feel less automatic. not because the existing system vanished. But more of the world seems less comfortable depending on only one set of corridors now. Across the system tonight, there are still ports operating beneath floodlights exactly the way they did years ago. Fuel transfers continuing through heavy rain. Container cranes moving slowly against harbour fog. Coffee cooling beside half-lit logistics screens before dawn. Most people inside those rooms are just trying to keep movement stable before morning. One shipment at a time. The visible world still looks connected tonight. But underneath those familiar movements, the structure supporting global trade has started becoming more layered than it once was. Somewhere tonight, freight schedules are still being rerouted quietly across rail systems, warehouse networks, pipelines, and ports, while most cities sleep. Most people will probably not recognize how much the system has changed until much later. The archive remains open. Good night.